Hey, this is Brian again, and I'd like to ask you to do a favor. We can't do this work without people like you, so if you can, please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends about Bring Back the Porch.
It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They put it all in place, put the context together, and now they can say, well, the Alberta Next panel is really driving this. And it's not. When you don't give people really a choice, your choice is yes or yes to whatever. What viability did that have?
This episode of Bring Back the Porch brought to you by Bernie Leahy, River Street Realty. Let's get you home. In the past few weeks, we have been told twice by members of the provincial government that perhaps we need to gather around the kitchen table to discuss the 9 referendum questions that Albertans will look at in October, and also look at the provincial budget that was announced right at the end of February. So this, to me, looks like a kitchen table.
Yeah.
Our favorite political scientist, Jim Groom, is here to talk about all the things that have been going on the provincial level, and maybe some other things too, if time allows. Welcome, Jim.
Yeah, well, thanks, Brian. You imagine how depressed your family would be sitting around the table talking about those 2 issues.
I'm not sure that when I look at the questions, I'm just not sure if anybody's going to participate, because it's way up here. I mean, we hear people, when we talk about voting in a civic election, I hear people say, well, I don't know enough about the issue, so I'm not going to vote. Well, this is a referendum that has no weight. It's not going to change anything. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, the last referendum that Jason Kenney held about equalization and the time change garnered about 38% of the population to vote on it. And the civic elections get that range as well, because, like you say, the people are overwhelmed when they go in and there's that many topics to pick from. The last municipal election, the delays were enormous. Can you imagine now where you have 9, maybe 10 different referendum questions? Some of the questions are actually, they aren't yes/no answers. No. They're much more, they're compound questions that lead you to, well, I agree with this part, but not that. You could have delays in the hours and hours trying to get in to do it. And people aren't going to stay and do it for that purpose. Unless you have an agenda that you've got to go and do this, because otherwise it's going to give the premier an out. So whatever the results are, the premier, if it doesn't support her base, she can go to the base and say, sorry guys, but the province, the electorate doesn't want it. If it does support the base, she can go to the people of Alberta and say, well, we gave you a chance to vote on this, and apparently you don't disagree with this or disagree with that, or are in favor of things, don't want immigration, whatever the case may be. So it really can play to their place, because, and it's a distraction, a very expensive distraction. I heard $50 million for the cost of doing it. And you think, got to be better ways to spend money in the current situation. And while we're talking about that, nobody is talking about healthcare. Nobody is talking about the chaos in schools. The list goes on, or the $8.4 billion deficit that we're facing. So it's definitely gives them a distraction. It gives them an out. It's it's kind of too bad. It seems. There was nobody crying for a referendum, and especially with these issues. The UCP had brought it up during their AGM, and of course this is one of the ones about the immigration in particular. And during Daniel Smith's tour around the province 2 summers ago, there was a lot of questions about immigration, and there was accusations that the immigrants were all Nazis. And of course this was Putin's plan that the Ukrainians were Nazis, and he was denazifying the Ukraine and all this, and a lot of people had bought into that, and some of the constituencies brought that up as legitimate, and then of course Calgary Buffalo brought it in as the 3rd recommendation on the AGM, and the premier is running with it, because she's got to stay premier. She doesn't want to go into political oblivion like Jason Kenney did, so she's got to keep her party happy.
A lot of people have just said, well, why don't you just call a general election and get a mandate from all of us?
Well, that's true. And I looked at that last budget and some of the spending that went with it, and I thought, gee, this looks like a spending budget, a pre-election budget. So maybe they'll do a referendum, and then she'll say, we're not supposed to go to the polls in April, it's supposed to be October, but maybe she'll say, yeah, we're going to go early because we've got to satisfy all these demands that you've made now that 30% of you showed up and voted on these issues. Now we have to do something about it. You know, it's politicians, and this is not just the UCP, all politicians exploit the system to the benefit of their advantage, and it's just unfortunate that it's quite so blatant and unnecessary at this time.
In these 9 questions, do they need to ask us if we support this? Can they not just start down the road of talking to the other provinces about the constitutional issues, talking with the federal government about immigration? Do they need us to push them in the back? Not
at all. This is the gaslighting that Jason Kenney did too. When he did the referendum on equalization, equalization is in the Constitution. I think it's Section 35 or something, but it's in the Constitution. It's not something that one province can unilaterally change. So when they came out with that referendum, it was almost like, yeah, tell us about this, folks, and then we can change it. Well, they couldn't change it unilaterally. Nobody would. They'd need 7 provinces with 50% of the population in order to make a change on equalization. And why would you do that when you're actually receiving more money than you're giving for 7 out of 10 of the provinces? So it's self-serving, and the equalization formula that's currently in place was done by Mr. Harper, and in his cabinet was Jason Kenney, and they did a very pro-Quebec move at that point because they wanted a majority government, and so they thought they could entice Quebecers to vote for them. And they gave the money to Mr. Charest, who was the premier of Quebec, and he did a very unconstitutional thing. He gave it to direct tax cuts to the people because it was coming up to an election, and he took that extra money from the equalization. He gave it directly to the people. He was reelected, and Mr. Harper did win a majority, but it had nothing to do with Quebec because I think they maxed out in like 12 seats in Quebec at the best times. Quebecers just did not like Mr. Harper. But that's the same formula that we currently have in place. And nobody can change it because Quebec would not want that change because it really does favor Quebec in many respects. So it's the same with these particular questions, especially the constitutional questions here. The province does have the right to do influence immigration, but it doesn't have the right to change the Constitution unilaterally. And to suggest that they're going to do this is just, once again, playing to the base that says, yeah, we can do these changes, but as you say, all they have to do is go and negotiate with Ottawa anyway. It's the same bottom line.
These 9 questions, I think they stem from the Alberta Next panel that was touring the province in the last 18 months. Yeah. So this is just, I guess, that next step that they're taking.
Well, the unfortunate thing is, of course, the next Alberta Next panel was geared in a very specific way. If you went online to do the surveys and things, they made you, indoctrinated you first with some videos, and then if you went and actually attended, you found that the only people that were allowed to speak were really the people who supported the government's position on everything, which was the UCP base. And the moderator was very strong at cutting people off who didn't agree with the discussion and the way it went. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They put it all in place, put the context together, and now they can say, well, the Alberta Next panel is really driving this. And it's not. When you don't give people really a choice, your choice is yes or yes to whatever. I mean, what viability does that have?
The other question that we might be asked isn't on the referendum slate yet, but it might be, and that is separation. For sure. And that would bring people, I think, to the polls.
Well, I would hope that, like every time we have an election and there's 40% turnout in some of these, I always feel like democracy is broken to an extent. And I would hope that people would come out, and it might be that you'd get a lot more turnout for that. And people might come out and only fill out that portion of the survey, which is fine. there, we saw from the pro-Canada group that 460-some-thousand people signed a petition that said we want to stay with Canada. Now we'll have to see the numbers that come out finally in March, I guess it is, for the separatist groups, and see how that works exactly. But I'm not sure how many more surveys and polls and things have to be done. Unfortunately, the government has a tendency to ask for input and then ignore it, and come forward and say, well, the healthcare as an example. They said, well, we've got 26,000 people who responded to our online questions, but they went in an opposite direction than what those people wanted, because one of the things people wanted most was a one-stop shop for healthcare, and they did the exact opposite. Policing in Alberta, the same thing. The rural municipalities voted 70% against losing the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and yet we see that more and more they're doing an interim change. And they used to be able to say, well, because it was unsure when we signed the contract in 2032, will we still will it be offered by the feds? And the feds have now clearly come out and said, we're not canceling the provincial contracts. We're standing by them. So now they don't have that as an excuse, and yet just the other day another step was made to bring in the sheriff to replace the RCMP. And it's part of the political agenda that started way back in the beginning, and the next thing will be our pension plans, probably. Alberta pension plan will kick in, or whatever. Things that the population has all said in polls, we don't want this. Yeah. And yet it's on the agenda. And the Premier is stuck between a rock and a hard place. She's got her party, who has very strident beliefs and particular beliefs, and we have the public, the voters, who have different beliefs. And she's got to play both sides towards the middle in order to be satisfied, which is part, I think, why they come up with these 9 questions, so that she can go back and say to the party, I can't cross the voters, or she can go to the voters and say, well, the party, I got to stick with their beliefs because you guys wanted it.
I was wondering, too, by putting a vote on separation, a referendum on separation out there for everyone, does that lay it to rest potentially then? If there's 2/3 people say no and 1/3 say yes, does that put that to bed, or is it just going to still simmer under the surface?
Yeah. The folks who want independence are strident believers of it. They are, very, very solid in their beliefs. If you look at the Quebec example, in 80 they had the first referendum, 95 the second referendum, and now the PQ is talking about being government again, and one of the promises they say, we'll have another referendum. So it's almost like, well, we're going to continue until we get the right answer. And the right answer has to be what we want it to be, not what everybody seems to want. So I would say, depending on the next provincial election, it may be put to bed if, as an example, the UCP doesn't win the next election. Mm-hmm. It may move on and say, yeah, those people can continue to complain, they can continue to seek independence, but for all intents and purposes, as a province, we are united in staying in Canada.
You recently were talking about separation here in Medicine Hat at an event at St. John's Church. What was the mood in the room there?
Well, I think that this is the kind of the opposite side of the coin of the UCP supporters, who are very much in favor of a lot of the things that are suggestions. The anti-racist aspect that we see coming from the States. And, Trump in his State of the Union address the other day said if it wasn't for all the fraud by immigrants, we could have balanced the budget. Well, if you believe that, well, with all the other lies that he gave. Unfortunately, there is a small vocal minority that really have very strident positions and are not particularly democratic. The group that I was talking with the other day are the exact opposite. They are pro-Canada. They believe Alberta is very viable. They are happy with Alberta. They don't see immigrants as the enemy. A lot of the same aspects. The rise of the right that we see internationally wouldn't be so bad if it was just a physical position, that they were physical conservatives. But they bring with them all this social change, and it's not democratic, and it's racist in some cases, and it's very extreme, and they're very strident about it, and it's very much a us and them situation, and there's not much level for negotiations or compromise, and there's a whole suite of things that they bring with them that, anti-trans, anti-gay, et cetera, that really reverts back to 30, 40, 50 years ago when people had these ideas. As political scientists, we used to think that a progressive agenda would continue on a sort of a continuum, like a straight line at a curve going up, and it doesn't. It jigs and jags up and down and all over the place, and that's what we're seeing particularly today.
Also in Alberta, we have seen several recall petitions for MLAs. Not one of them has been successful yet. But do you think that's had any influence on what's happening in Edmonton?
I think it has, in that it was a symbolic gesture. Lots of people knew that the threshold was way too high, that we would never achieve it. And, of course, Jason Kenney put that in place originally. And one of his members brought forward a private member's bill at first, Mr. Smith, actually, out of Drayton Valley. And they rejected that after the first reading because the government wanted to make sure there was a safe kind of aspect, because recalling somebody in the opposition really doesn't really make a lot of sense. Recalling the government is the decision makers that you're dissatisfied with. So they always knew it was going to be an attack on government members, if anything. And so they put a very specific high thresholds in there. I'm not particularly in favor of the entire process. I don't think recall is necessarily the design. If you don't agree with the policies of the government, that gives you a chance to vote against them on the next election. But symbolically, this maybe made some impact of, well, maybe we're not doing everything right. Maybe there is a group out there. Of course, they can say that it was just driven by the NDP or driven by the unions or whatever they want. It's not really the case. It really was a grassroots movement, which is interesting to see, that strong grassroots movement rising up.
We're also seeing the rise of perhaps another party in Alberta with, is it Peter Guthrie? Is he the...
Peter Guthrie, yes, and the Tories.
They tried
Tory
to
party.
bring back the progressive conservative brand, and that was nixed by the courts. But what do you think? Do they have a chance of dividing the right in the next provincial election, or even forming government?
So for a political party to really be viable, they need a ground game. They need to be able to go to the 87 and by that time 89 ridings in the province and actually have constituency associations that are congealed. They have the establishment of a president, vice president, secretary, all, and is formed that way. That's a lot of work, and it requires a lot of financial support. And they don't have that at this point. At this point, Peter Guthrie is sort of a standalone opposition. We saw this with the Alberta Party. In the last election, the Alberta Party was only able to put candidates in, I think, 24 seats out of the 87 at that time. And yet it had been viable for a while. It looked like it was good, but it just didn't find a niche market there. And as we continue to polarize, this becomes a problem. Now, having said that, there are a lot of people who still believe that the NDP is a bridge too far for them. Mm-hmm. They need to be in that former progressive conservative range where it's common sense government, big tent aspects, accept all kinds of policies and procedures. The trouble is that's a cadre party, and it has to exist, and people have to then join it because they believe that their policies are reflective of their beliefs. A grassroots party is much different. It takes a lot more work to do that. And, of course, you need input from all kinds of different areas. And then how do you exactly get your policies to gel? Where are you going to end up as far as the political momentum is concerned? So I think it'd be premature to say that even in a year from now that they will be a viable party and have candidates, effective candidates in every riding. It's an enormous undertaking, and I'm not sure Peter Guthrie really has the backing. he had some controversy even before he was UCP, and so I'm not sure he's necessarily the beacon on the hill that everybody would go to as a devotee party sort of thing.
I wonder if Thomas Lukasik would consider taking the lead in some sort of a movement in Alberta.
Of course, Thomas was very controversial when he was a PC minister and deputy premier, and he was a little polarizing at that point too. Now, of course, politics in the province has changed since then, and he has come forward with the pro-Canada approach and was very effective, great speaker when he was addressing things, comes from the background that really hardworking kind of grassroots, former immigrant, that sort of aspect. I would think he would be approached by some folks. The question, of course, is he was, as a progressive conservative, he had the NDP as the opposition when he was in government, as well as others. And I'm not sure he'd actually be able to say, okay, maybe I can join the NDP. Maybe I would be persuaded to do that. I think he would probably reject that. And once again, starting from scratch and saying, yeah, how can I formulate a party? The ground game is so important for that. For every riding has to have a movement in order to do that. And it may be there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the UCP. So it may be that there are people out there looking for an alternative. Is there enough people in a broad enough area?
Another thing that has popped up in the last week is the Alberta Federation of Labour organizing a day of protest in May. Last time we heard from them was during the teacher strike when they were talking about a general strike, and then that kind of just fizzled and left some hard feelings among those people in Labour. Do you think that the AFL are going to change the playbook a little bit here?
Well, one of the problems is that the percentage of union-employed folks in the province has continued to slump over the years, to the point now where it's a rump of what it used to be at one point. And Alberta's never been a big union province, I think we can say, because the oil industry wasn't big on unions, et cetera, and so if this doesn't work for them, if this is kind of a flash in the pan, I think that's as good as we can expect from them at this point. There's lots of folks that agree with their positions. I don't think the NDP wants to tie themselves completely with the union side because they need a broader base to get elected. So where is it politically for them? They're really a bit of the wilderness is what they're in.
Well, now he'd eventually be able to increase the number of seats for the MLAs in his NDP party.
I think he probably could. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of Neshi's leadership in the NDP since he's been in, and it's been kind of, where are you on these topics? The referendum, as an example, they waited till the next day to put out their rebuttal to this aspect, and people were like, well, why weren't you right off the bat? Because social media now, you get the news right away, everybody's commenting on it and everybody's giving their position, and we tend to lock into those positions, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, or you're looking for confirmation bias as you've already decided certain things. So to change people's minds after they've already kind of bought into something is a lot more difficult than to get in there right off the bat and say, look, this is wrong and why it's wrong, and have your ducks in a row. I doubt very much that they were totally surprised by this coming out, and they should have had something in their back pocket to pull out and say, boom, this is what's wrong here. Because when you listen to his arguments after the fact, he's very logical, he makes sense, and he's got stats to support him and everything, but by that time the media cycle has shifted to the next thing. And this is part of the technique of modern politics, is to flood the zone. Donald Trump does it, and all his advisors tell him to do it. Just flood the zone so Trump can say something completely outlandish, but it doesn't even get covered the next day because he's on to something else totally more outlandish. And how often have we heard this is unprecedented? And I didn't think he could go this low, but he's gone low, and the next day he goes even lower. And it It's just all those other things. Like it gets challenging to actually decide, well, what has the government done in all these different aspects, and how do we congeal that information and then present it to an electorate who really don't have time to constantly sit and monitor the different sources of information.
Yeah. The Alberta budget forecasting the 9.4.6 billion with a B dollar deficit.
Yeah, I think I said 8 before, but you're right. It is 9 now.
But the price of oil, because of the conflict in Iran, has been coming up. I think the figure is for every $10 rise in the price of a barrel of oil, Alberta reaps $20 million a day. So they might get a get out of jail free card there.
Wow. What a way to do it. Of course, the predictability of those prices is a little bit questionable. Somebody's going to open the Strait of Hormuz. They're not going to allow that 1/5 of the oil to stay in there. The natural gas and the liquefied natural gas still is going to start to flow back to Europe again too. So Trump, I think, has been saying, well, we might be in Iran for 4 weeks and continue to bomb, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, the infrastructure for Iran to stop any oil flow. And Iran hasn't been producing anything on the international market except for China because they've been under sanctions, of course, right? So it's just a matter that it's impacting on Saudi Arabian oil and Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. And that I think will stop fairly shortly. Will it go back to $60 or $64 as an average? That's hard to say, but I don't think it's going to have the same impact on long term that it's going to save the Alberta budget. We just, and of course the bitumen bubble is still, 10% less than WTI. So, I mean, it does help us some, but yeah, I think to tie our success for the next budget and average and say, well, it's going to be $75 like some economists have suggested we need in order to balance our budget, it's just totally unrealistic.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that Venezuelan oil now is back into the picture, and that is direct competition to Alberta's heavy crude.
Yes, and the Gulf Coast where all the heavy oil is refined for Venezuela. Most of the heavy oil for Alberta is still refined in the West, and Chicago has a couple of refineries, et cetera. But the infrastructure needed to get Venezuela going again. When Trump had his meeting with the major oil companies, there was nobody jumping up and saying, well, yeah, we want to take $100 billion and throw it against the oil in Venezuela so that we can perhaps be successful, because the old regime is still in charge there. And I mean, they nationalized the oil industry. Are they suddenly going to say, yes, come on in? And the equipment that they use there is so archaic and broken down because they didn't maintain it, because the government just let it kind of go. And then, of course, sanctions were in, so they didn't have a market for it. So it just kind of fell apart. So I've heard estimates of 10 years at least, and $100 billion to get that industry up and running. And I'm not sure there's somebody out there with that kind of money that wants to do that at this stage, because there's so much oil available elsewhere that they can use. So I don't think that is really a threat. And I think it's the figure I've heard last is 50% of our bitumen is going to China now, rather than to the United States. Well, the other half is going to the United States, but it's a little less than what it was because we're producing more, of course. And, of course, China was getting their oil from Iran, so we might have much more market access there than we would from being concerned about Venezuelan oil going into the United States.
Turning to national politics now, Pierre Poilievre survived the confidence vote in Calgary at the end of January, but he had lost another MP to defection, walked across the floor, became a Liberal. And I think I saw somewhere last week where he was calling for a federal election. Would he really want to do that?
I don't think anybody wants an election at the current time. Well, obviously, the NDP is in the midst of a leadership race, and they have nothing in their coffers. They're broke. Right? The Liberals aren't particularly flushed with cash either. There's 3 by-elections coming up, which could go either way for Conservative or Liberal prospects. So there's that aspect. I don't really think anybody wants an election currently because the people will reject it, for one thing, I think, and whoever has to be called by the government. But if the government calls it because their hands is forced in some way, shape, or form, they can say, we didn't want it, but we have to do it because all our legislation is being blocked by the Conservatives. And if we can vilify them, then they'd be successful. On the other hand, if Carney says, I just need that majority because I don't want to have to work for my legislation anymore, the people would reject that as well. There's a certain level of, we just aren't willing to go ahead with any more elections, in my opinion. When Matt Genereux came across, you notice that he was on the trip with Carney to China and Australia, etc. And if that's not sending a message to the backbenchers in the Conservative Party that not only can you come walk over across the floor, be in our bailiwick, but we will actually respect your opinion, put you in a position of some responsibility, treat you fairly. I mean, Carney would, would love to be able to send that message and say to people, come on over, all I need is a couple more to make it a majority government. And if that does occur, of course, Poilievre is 20 points lower than Carney as far as prime ministerial qualities are concerned. And the party see him now as a drain on them as opposed to booing them up. And although he got 87% in the leadership vote, there's no honor among thieves if all people want in politics is power. And if they can't get it, they were going to find somebody else that will get it for them. I'm not sure if they have anybody as a person in waiting for that. That's the trick at this point. Nobody's chopping at his heels saying, move over so I can take over. There's no Paul Martin, trying to get John Chrétien out of the way so he can have his time as president, prime minister.
One final topic is the performance of our city council since the election in October. What are your thoughts on it? They seem to be a more cohesive unit than what we saw in the previous 4 years. I
haven't seen any knuckle dusters coming out. I haven't seen any brass knuckles or any feuds that way. They seem very conducive. They do, as all city councils do, push things back for further studies. They're very cautious that way. And I think that's good because it's the taxpayers' funds. They haven't had much to say about the increase in the education tax that came from the province, which every time you get your taxes, you see the bottom line, and very few people will go and read that, I think it's 24% or something they put it up. Last time it was 14%, and this is from a provincial government that said, we're not going to raise any taxes without a referendum. And, well, they didn't mention that they could do it through the municipalities and look like they're innocent, but that's what they're doing, of course. But it's not in their best interest in Medicine Hat to say anything against the government. I mean, they have to work with the federal provincial government, and there's a lot of conservative voters here in Medicine Hat, but they do seem to be really balanced and a little bit more cohesive, as you say, Brian. And I think it's a good thing because we couldn't have gotten any lower than what we had previously. And a lot of folks didn't vote for the mayor this time that did last time. She got 30 some odd percent as opposed to 60, but she seems to be holding her own. I don't know if she's changed spots since the provincial report came out that said she was, I don't know if I'd call it a micromanager, but there was issues for sure. But it seems like people are, and let's face it, you can have a group of 10 people and everybody will get along great, and you take one other person in or out of that dynamic and it can completely change the dynamics of it. So this one does seem to be working, and let's hope it continues.
I did notice on the debate over the Salmon Solar project that several of the councillors who campaigned that they did not were not in favor of that project. They were all united when it came to moving forward. And I think that there's something they know that we don't know yet that has influenced their decision.
Well, of course, a lot of them, some of them, come from a very conservative background, and the UCP has helped as much as they can to kill the natural resource industry from solar, wind, etc. And I think there probably is a bit of a thought that they have to support that if they want to continue a political career down the road that is in provincial politics. But from a practical point of view, unity within a voting group, there's lots of compromise that happens, and you agree to this position on this topic so that this person will agree with you on this topic, and you end up with that compromise. And sometimes it looks like you're not standing by your principles, but other times it is, to make it work, we've got to compromise. I'll play with you on this one, you play with me on that one.
You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Yes. And it's an old political thing. It's not moral in any way, shape, or form, I don't think. I think it's just the way things are done with working with people.
One other thing that stands out from the work that City Council has done is they put the Riverside project, the traffic plan.
The transportation plan, yes.
Yeah, because people were still not happy with what happened on Division Avenue. So they actually listened to the people on that one. Yeah,
I think that's true. Now, I had to go to council in order for that to occur because City Hall seemed like they were fully ahead, right? All pedal to the metal, they were going to go ahead. And the council stood up and said, hold it, folks, we're getting feedback that's not so positive. And there was lots of feedback that was not so positive. And so that demonstrates their effectiveness, I think. I think it demonstrates that they are listening and that they are willing to put their 2 cents in. Now, they've gone back to the drawing board, and they're doing a whole bunch more public consultation, et cetera, et cetera. It's tough to take those professionals in City Hall who know the future and know the impact of what they're doing and listen effectively to a citizen who says, but I don't want to have to do that when I come out to go to work that morning, right? It's a real difficult thing. And the city, the council has really, I think, listened, and I think they played a role that they should at this point.
Jim Groom, another kitchen table discussion, and I'm sure that the powers that be will give us more to talk about as we move forward. Thank you for the visit.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brian, for having me.